The late 90s was a great time for survival horror games. Resident Evil, Parasite Eve, Clock Tower, Silent Hill, and several other franchises were all knocking it out of the park with the very capable newfangled 32-bit systems and massive amounts of space available on compact discs. Few genres benefited from the new levels of space and power available to game developers as survival horror did. Shinji Mikami, fresh off of the wild success of Resident Evil, was moving right along into many new projects to round out the 20th century and welcome the new millennium, one of which was 1999's Dino Crisis. At first, calling Dino Crisis Resident Evil with dinosaurs seems like a fitting elevator pitch, and in many ways it is, but once you get a few hours into it, you would notice several areas where the Resident Evil formula was being liberally tinkered with. For instance, the inventory system was more convenient, and gone were the pre-rendered backgrounds of years ago. Now, much like Silent Hill, the entire environment was rendered in real time, making the characters feel more like a part of their world, instead of just existing on top of it. Also, gone are the days of standing still while aiming your weapon, as Dino Crisis let you walk around while aiming, which was a welcome tweak to the formula, and made combat feel a lot less stiff than Resident Evil. Obviously, the biggest thing setting this game apart from the others in the genre is the fact that dinosaurs were the primary antagonists, and that really resonated with fans and made the game easy to create marketing for. That aspect alone would go on to be the reason why tons of copies of the first game were sold, and it would eventually become one of Capcom's most successful games. Despite the success that Dino Crisis managed to carve out for itself though, and the legions of old school fans who still take to the internet to ask for a new one, we are now sitting at well over a decade since the last main installment. Why is that? What the hell happened to Dino Crisis? Logically, a sequel wasn't far behind the first game, but unlike most survival horror sequels that tend to make it a point to stick to what worked and just make modest improvements, Dino Crisis 2 completely threw everything out the window in terms of style and tone and rebuilt the franchise as a very arcadey action experience with lots of weapons, ammo, and much more linear level design. Ultimately, it was still received well, although for very different reasons than the first. Dino Crisis 2 set the series in a new direction that would continue to favor action and style over substance, and for the most part, reviewers and gamers were fine with that. Soon after Dino Crisis 2 was released, we got the next generation of consoles, and with that, Dino Stalker was released by Capcom exclusively for the PlayStation 2 and was kind of a spin-off light gun game that still existed in the same universe as the previous games. As a light gun game, it wasn't bad, but reviewers and subsequent sales figures weren't so kind to Dino Stalker. Major outlets were giving it mediocre to less than mediocre scores. Many complaints were leveled, but one of the common denominators was the overly sensitive aiming cursor, and if you had to play it without an actual light gun, you were in for a hard time. The fact that it wasn't a great light gun game or a great Dino Crisis game sort of made it hard to determine just where the game fit with its audience. If you had a PlayStation 2, then you also had access to better light gun games, and you also had access to better Dino Crisis games via the PlayStation 1 games. This, coupled with the fact that the second Dino Crisis game had so little in common with the first, kind of threw the whole identity of the franchise completely up in the air. To say you were a Dino Crisis fan didn't really say much, as it could mean you were a fan of the survival horror original, the action-adventure sequel, or the light gun spin-off game. It would be a couple more years before Capcom would release Dino Crisis 3 exclusively for the Xbox, which was in and of itself an odd move, as the majority of the franchise's fanbase were PlayStation or Dreamcast owners at this point, and it didn't help that Dino Crisis 3 just wasn't a very good game. Much like the first sequel, Dino Crisis 3 seemed to ignore what little of the tone was left intact at this point, and essentially went the Jason X route by throwing the story comically far into the future and square in the middle of a nonsensical space story that came off as ridiculous from the get-go. And despite some relatively well-designed dinos, the game really didn't have much going for it and performed relatively poorly in almost every way. This was sad to see for the franchise, and probably served as the final straw for the franchise that was always a cool idea but never quite found its footing with a consistent tone to establish a core audience. I can understand how it would make sense to retire Dino Crisis at that point. If you have over 3 games in a franchise and still haven't established what the franchise is even supposed to be, then as a publisher, why would you continue to allocate resources and talent to that franchise when Capcom knows they have so many more excellent games to make that do have an identity opportunity and do have a clear path to success. Frankly, given the track record of the series up to this point, I would be more surprised if they kept coming out with sequels. However, what would a new Dino Crisis be? Another action game? Sci-fi? Or would it return to its survival horror roots? Or maybe some combination of these elements? It's hard to say, but with all of the interest in the new Jurassic World movies, I'm sure there's at least one person within the walls of Capcom that's thinking about it. Maybe the time is right for them to take another stab at the franchise. Maybe it's not. But one thing is for sure, with all of the time that has passed, and the ambiguous nature in which the franchise has been left, whatever studio would be tasked with making the new Dino Crisis would surely have their work cut out for them.
And that about does it for this video. If you enjoyed what you watched and want to see more from GamingBolt, you can always hit that subscribe button and turn on the bell icon next to it. That way you will never miss any of our videos.